And as I thought about this account, I was astonished by the way that a story from the 4th century could speak so directly to the beginning of the 21st century, as though it were a parable for our times. I first became aware of this story when I and 3 other painters were invited to submit designs for an altarpiece in a little chapel in the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral that was dedicated to an order of chivalry whose patron saint was St Martin of Tours. Now, the story that is always represented from St Martin's life is a story of when he was a young man in the Roman army, and he saw a naked beggar, and he cut his cloak in two and gave half of it to the beggar. And that night he had a dream in which he saw Christ wearing the other half, and it's a wonderful story. And during the Middle Ages there are thousands of representations of it. But the thing is that it's a 2-part story, and you need to understand the second part in order to grasp its meaning. But of course today most people who come to St Paul's wouldn't know that story, and for that reason really it didn't really grab my imagination. It didn't sort of spark anything. But we were told that we didn't have to represent that story. It could be anything from the life of St Martin. So I started reading his life, and I discovered this story, which comes from right the other end of his life, when he'd been made a bishop. And he lived at the time just after Constantine had converted, and suddenly Christianity had gone from being an illegal, persecuted religion to being the official religion of the Roman Empire. And suddenly Christians who had been persecuted had the ear of power. They were in a position where if they wanted to, they could persecute others. And it was a really a moment of testing, and some failed that test. In particular, in France, the bishops, always for the 300 years of its existence, Christianity had struggled with heresies, but now bishops saw they could use the secular power to deal with that problem. And these bishops wanted to persecute a sect called the Priscillians, and the emperor was very happy to do this, because if he executed people who were involved with the sect, he could take their property and replenish his own coffers. But Martin was fiercely, he was an opponent of the Priscillians, but he thought this was absolutely the wrong way to proceed, and he managed to get to the emperor, and he thought he'd persuaded him not to kill Priscillius, but he failed. But then he managed to get a second audience, and it was actually very dangerous for him to do this, because he could have been identified as a heretic and lost his own life. But he actually managed to persuade the emperor not to persecute in this way. And partly it was because he was said that if you started this kind of pogrom, all kinds of innocent people, and just ordinary Christians, would be caught up with it. But more importantly, this was not the way of Christ. We were meant to overcome evil, not overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. This was not how Christians should act in the world. And extraordinarily, he managed to persuade the emperor that not to do it. But the emperor then wanted solidarity with the bishops, and he said that Martin must be reconciled and take communion with the other bishops. But Martin was extremely uneasy about this, because the other bishops hadn't repented from this. They still wanted this to go ahead. And so, but then the emperor said that unless Martin did as he said and took communion with the other bishops, he would go on persecuting and killing people, and that just didn't seem to leave any choice. So Martin did what he said and took communion, but on his way home he was deeply troubled in his conscience. Had he done the right thing? What should he have done? And at a certain point, when he got to a place called Andathana, a great wood, he sent all his followers away, and he wrestled with himself. And according to his disciple Severus, Martin told them that he saw an angel who told him that he had reason to be worried, but he didn't have any choice. Now he was to go on, and Severus said that Martin didn't like telling this story because he felt it was a real failure in his life. But to me, this story was extraordinary. And as I thought about this account, I was astonished by the way that a story from the 4th century could speak so directly to the beginning of the 21st century, as though it were a parable for our times. It's not just that we live in a world where totalitarian regimes are silencing any kind of dissent, or where religious minorities are being persecuted by religious majorities, but that even in liberal democracies we seem to have developed a culture and a practice aided by social media where we gang up and hound those with any kind of dissident or heretical views, so that it takes immense courage even to stand up with those you agree with, let alone to stand up for the rights of those you disagree with. So that in the picture I proposed, I have the forest of Andathana is sort of peopled by contemporary thought police chasing the fleeing heretics. But at the centre is this picture of St. Martin struggling with his conscience. And I suppose the corollary of the conviction that of intolerance is the conviction that the problem is always with other people, it's never with ourselves. But in this story, St. Martin doesn't think of himself as the hero of what is going on. He was absolutely conscious of his own failure. We like, I suppose, to think of saints as people without flaws, but this is an image of a saint as of someone who is so conscious of his own flaws that he is constantly open to the need for truth and grace. So that at the heart of this picture is really about grace and forgiveness and mercy. Anyway, I presented my design, and it seemed to be well received. But a few days later, I was rung up and told that no, this wasn't really what they wanted. They wanted the traditional image, and then I was faced with my own crisis of conscience, because the thing was that this was actually a commission that I passionately wanted to get, and partly this was because my father had actually been responsible for setting up this Order of Chivalry and designing their coat of arms and everything, and so it meant a great deal to me personally. But also the little chapel was situated in Painter's Corner in St Paul's, where there were memorial tablets to Turner and Constable and Reynolds and all my great sort of painter heroes. So I passionately wanted to do it. And yet, when I had sought inspiration for this this image, this was the picture that I seem to have been given. And I just felt I couldn't just go back and do a conventional image. I had to be faithful to this. And so I asked if I could nevertheless submit this design. They said, warned me, but said yes, I could. So I spent months actually working on this image, and I did present it to them. And in the end, it wasn't what they wanted, and that was fair enough. But then I was left with the question of what do I do with this image? And I thought maybe I'd do the large version that I'd intended to do for the altarpiece and take it round to churches dedicated to St. Martin. But in the end, I wrote a poem about it, which I included in my first collection of poems, The Nearer You Stand. And the poem was just called St. Martin at Andathana, and it begins with an epigraph from Sulpicius Severus, the disciple of St. Martin, and then goes on. So, St. Martin at Andathana, not far from a village named Andathana, where remote woods stretch far and wide with profound solitude, he sat down while his companions went on a little before him. There he became involved in deep thought, alternately accusing and defending the cause of his grief and conduct. Suddenly an angel stood by him and said, "Justly, O Martin, do you feel compunction? But you could not otherwise get out of your difficulty. Renew your virtue, resume your courage." Within a river of blue flowers, the images do not cohere. There is no place in any world where this conjunction would appear. These figures at the picture's edge, with straining dogs that hunt their prey, while fleeing down perspective lines their quarry try to get away, should not exist in the same frame as Martin kneeling on the ground in Andathana's darkened wood, in which a gold-winged angel stood above him like a burning flame. Or if a truth does here cohere, it is in his prophetic soul, these persecuted heretics who, fleeing from his church's goal, are forcing all on pain of death to toe the line and think the same, are running down the ages' tracks as victims of a cognate aim, where all who think outside the herd are rounded up and disappeared. This desolate conjunction is Martin's own compunction for what the Church would teach the world. At Andathana, Severus said, where lonely woods stretch far and wide, St. Martin told his friends to leave, as in himself he agonized about a sacramental lie, the Eucharist that he had shared with bishops who had left the path, who neither thought nor even cared that force always defeats the goal of bringing lost lives to the light, since those who, searching for their path, must in an unforced step of faith find unguessed, unsought depths of grace as liberation of their soul. Martin of Tours was not the first to take this stand for liberty. The human right and privilege to choose to worship must be free. Religion will not be compelled, so fierce Tertullian had complained. Nearby in hot Numidia, Lactantius had said the same. All those who set out to defend religion using force or threat profane the freedom of the will. While their stand was just the same in persecution's bloody game, these lived on its receiving end. Of those now on the winning side, St. Martin still was not the first to stand against the creeping lie that gospel truth could be reversed, that love's reverse polarity of evil overcome by good could be switched back by those in power who used force now because they could. Was Martin, though, the first who braved destruction to defend the lives of those with whom he disagreed? 1,000 years before Voltaire, St. Martin lifted up in prayer the heretics that he had saved. And then that Eucharistic feast, collaborating with the lie, an emperor's diktat which decreed be reconciled or more will die, had seemed to leave no other choice. But now In Andethana's night, the violence of the future runs through every exercise of might. There all the fears that doubts create will jump the tracks in human life. Through jihads, gulags, or crusades, they silence every unheard voice. They run through each excluding choice, and through each age accelerate. Yet here in Andethana's wood, an angel is a burning flame, who at the centre of the world extends a hand to heal all shame, who knows the crisis of each soul and speaks to each with their own voice the gospel of the second chance, in which all life becomes a choice. Here none can watch or stand apart when, as the thought police pursue their various anathemas down sharp perspective lines of blue, those moments which shape destinies, like bluebells running through the trees, are choices running through the heart.